Hi everyone, my name's Alexa and I'm going to be discussing the culture of fear. So let's start by looking at what the culture of fear is. So the culture of fear is the process of individuals or institutions using fear as a way to manipulate the general population. This results in the public focusing on rare and less threatening problems instead of problems that threaten everyone. The fear also tends to be extremely exaggerated when compared to the threat itself. The people manipulating the public in this way are generally doing so as a way to gain money and power. There are so many examples of the culture of fear, but a commonly cited one is the public perception of crime and unemployment rates throughout the 90s. The general public found them both to be some of the biggest problems in the country, even though both crime and unemployment rates were steadily decreasing throughout the entire decade. Instead of seeing both issues as improving, they just continued to have this exaggerated fear of the threat they pose to our country. So, what causes a culture of fear? One of the biggest causes is how prone to fear mongering American society is. We're so used to watching the nightly news and constantly checking social media. And in these mediums, there are sensationalistic stories that are specifically designed to increase ratings. Instead of ensuring the reporting of objective information, there's often a focus on personal and emotional accounts. There are also scare tactics being used, like presenting rare events as the norm, victims being treated as experts, and misdirection. This manipulation causes extreme effects on the general public's perception of the state of the world. Like I've mentioned before, the culture of fear creates a heightened focus on small individual issues instead of widespread societal problems that affect a much higher proportion of the population. An example of this is the news coverage of a missing girl versus the coverage on poverty. Specifically, we can look at Gabby Petito's case. And when she went missing, she got 24/7 coverage for many days. When we compare that to poverty, which is a huge problem that significantly affects millions of people every day, there's very little coverage on poverty and its causes, how it impacts people, and ways to get out of poverty. The culture of fear also leads to greater pessimism and paranoia. This happens even when things are improving. I've included this quote here: "The more things improve, the more pessimistic we become." I wanted to provide another example of how the culture of fear shifts focus from major issues to small, rare issues because there's just so many different forms it can take. So here we have the issue of gun violence, specifically youth gun violence. And it's clear and obvious that it's a problem here in America, but it continues to be downplayed. In recent years, this has been shifting when we look at more left-leaning news sources, but the blame of youth gun violence still continues to be shifted from the availability of guns to things like violent video games, fights on TV and movies, and social media. Next, I'd like to speak about who benefits from the culture of fear. So I'm starting with this quote from Barry Glassner's The Culture of Fear book because I think it just sums it up really nicely and simply. "Immense power and money await those who tap into our moral insecurities and supply us with symbolic substitutes." So let's look at specifically what types of people benefit from the culture of fear. The more obvious ones are politicians and those that work in the media. Politicians can use the public's exaggerated fears to create campaign momentum and gain votes and donations. And those in the media can increase their ratings. Journalists, journalists can sell more papers. Advocacy groups can gain more supporters. Marketers can sell things that people wouldn't normally buy. And insurance providers can take advantage of paranoid people who are willing to buy more protection than they normally would be. Aside from the public being manipulated, there are very serious consequences to the culture of fear. This is probably obvious given my emphasis on small issues being focused on instead of major issues, but the culture of fear causes serious problems to be ignored. What's interesting is that the things being focused on are often caused by the bigger overarching problems that we're ignoring. An example of this is the correlation between poverty and drug use. Drug abuse tends to gain a lot of media attention, especially in the 90s when it was perceived as such a huge problem, like I mentioned before. However, drug abuse is often caused by poverty, which is something that's often overlooked in the media. Another problem is the increased spending on issues that often results in even more exaggerated fears. An example of this is when we spend money on prison cells and policing as a way to combat crime. Generally, this increased spending results in little to no improvement in crime and no reduction in public fear. Lastly, fear often has an inverse correlation with prevention. An example of this is when someone fears having a medical problem. Instead of getting it checked out right away, a person may tend to put it off because they fear having their suspicion confirmed. This causes the problem to become much worse than it might have if it were caught right away. 9/11 and the following War on Terror are considered to be a pretty major turning point in the culture of fear. While the culture of fear undeniably existed pre-9/11 with things like the war on drugs, violent youth, and medical scares, post-9/11 saw much harsher consequences like invading nations, censorships, and torturing prisoners. The perception of danger after minor mishaps was significantly heightened, especially with anything related to airlines. The war on terror itself is an example of fear-mongering. It's a vague phrase that instills fear in the public, and this allowed the Bush administration to easily push for policy agendas and provided a huge distraction from the impending US financial system disaster. So when we think of the culture of fear, we tend to focus on those major examples like the war on terror or the war on drugs. However, it also can affect how people react to more individual, small-scale issues. Examples of this are how people react to things like sexual assault, domestic assault, body image, and mental health. Specifically, when we focus on sexual assault, when people see that predators are tolerated, it can create a culture of fear around reporting that assault. People may fear not being believed, poor treatment from the criminal justice system, or being ostracized from the people in their life. Government officials and academics are generally not the ones who take on combating harmful exaggerations. Instead, reporters are often the ones debunking these scares. This is interesting because they're often the ones that benefit from the culture of fear, and many of them are trying to perpetuate it. When they do debunk these scares, it usually happens pretty far down the line. For example, in 1986, there was an article that claimed single women over 40 were more likely to be killed by a terrorist than to get married, and it took until 2006 for reporters to correct this. There are two main hopes for the culture of fear becoming less of a problem in the future. One is for professional truth seekers like journalists, public officials, and advocates to promptly question exaggerated scares as they appear. Another is for these fear campaigns to fail, and this would require a significant increase in the general population learning to recognize fear-mongering and failing to fall for it.